let's start there. Where did this go wrong for the Democrat Party? Was it the messaging? Was it the celebrity tactics? Was it the overwhelming media support and it worked against? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question and not one that I think we have a full answer to just yet. So there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do to diagnose exactly where things went wrong. I think the most likely scenario at this point, just looking at some of the data and essentially seeing how it shook out in all of the swing states, is it was kind of a death by 1,000 cuts scenario where you had a bunch of different headwinds essentially blowing into the Harris campaign. I will say that I feel like they ran as good a campaign as anyone has in recent memory, and I think it's easy to forget how difficult a job that they had, putting a campaign together on a minute's notice.
Fast. Yeah.
Very, very difficult to do that. I mean, because usually, again, like if you're looking at a presidential campaign from primary all the way through to the general election, you're talking about over a year's worth, or sometimes even more worth of preparation for getting into the race, developing policy positions, building out a team, building out infrastructure, and all the places that you need infrastructure. So and raising money, obviously, and they did all of that in a very condensed time frame. What I think the biggest factors, though, kind of just zooming out a little bit in this election, are a couple of big trends in terms of elections really kind of looking like change elections in the United States every single cycle, and we didn't always see that, right? You would see people get reelected. You would see some degree of satisfaction with our leaders at different points, save for different events that were sort of larger events that kind of contribute to a general malaise. But I think what we're looking at is a sort of this broad dissatisfaction across the board and globally. Honestly, if you look globally, there haven't been too many incumbent parties across the globe that have fared too well in the last couple of years. So, there were a lot of issues. I know, people are going to talk about inflation a lot, but I think generally speaking, I mean, if you look at the United States economy, we've done a heck of a lot better than most of the world on pushing inflation down, economic recovery after the pandemic. But again, those things don't necessarily always translate to how people feel in their day-to-day lives. So that's sort of the dance that you do. But I think there's some broader trends as well where you see certain demographic groups. I think social media plays a huge role in a lot of this, where you're seeing all sorts of content that illustrates these lifestyles that I think are by and large unattainable for most of us, right? So like you see a lot of folks talking about how they're jumping on their private jet for a vacation, or just bought this Lamborghini, I'm going to drive around, and like quite frankly that's just not an attainable thing, and yet you're bombarded with this information all of the time. So I think there is a level of dissatisfaction that we're dealing with that is very hard to put our finger on in sort of traditional ways, but I think the media and information environment that we exist in definitely contributed to again that sense of malaise that led to what looks like, again, a change election. So it's like change, but not change at the same time, because we're kind of going back to something that we had before as well. So those are sort of the broad strokes, I think, and we'll find out more.
And there's no bigger game than the U.S. election from a communication strategy standpoint. The campaign leaders would have known as much as anybody in the world could have known, because there's no bigger game. They would have known to some degree about those headwinds, and then post-election results, you get a much clearer picture, I'm sure. But was the messaging on spot? Did it start in the right place? Did it finish in the right place? Let's start with the messaging. Did they hit the notes with the messaging that they should have, and were they delivered in a way? It's one thing to have the right messages. The other is, were they delivered right? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really interesting question. And I think, and this isn't always a popular sort of opinion to hold, but I think that we need to have the humility as practitioners of politics, communication practitioners, to admit that there are things that we do not know. And I think we're going to have to approach the diagnosis of what happened with again, humility, with curiosity, and really try to dig into how some of these trend lines were, I don't want to say missed, but probably buried under other stuff. So in terms of messaging, I think generally speaking, the messaging that the campaign pursued was by and large the right messaging based on the data that we had, right? So like nothing really goes out the door on a big presidential campaign without some degree of measurement, focus groups, polling, ad testing online with with panels and other methods like that. So to the extent that they were pursuing the right or wrong messaging, I think directionally it was probably okay. I think also there maybe was a lack of appreciation for how potent some of the Republican messaging may have been on, in particular, social issues, right? So, like, I think the big disconnect is sort of this idea of the economy, which I think when we talk about the economy, we a lot of analysis misses the fact that like we're not actually talking about the economy itself. We're talking about a vibe, essentially, like how people feel in their daily lives. And that doesn't even necessarily have to be from a financial perspective. It's just like the economy seems to have taken on this sort of catch-all character for how we describe people's lived experiences in the world. So when you have an election where people have, quote, economic concerns, and they're hearing a lot about social policy that is, I don't want to say slightly out of the mainstream, but like the Overton window hasn't shifted on some of these issues yet for the majority of the population. That, when you feel like one party is focusing on those things over economic interest, over lived experience day to day for most Americans, that can create some real tensions and problems. So I think that's where the messaging fell flat. Now the open question is like, how do you respond to those things? So you have the Republicans running these ads. There was one running in the Philadelphia media market for mostly on radio. It may have been on TV as well, but it was just running on loop where it was like, Kamala Harris is for they, them, right? Like that whole sort of pronouns type culture wars debate. And again, like
and Trump is for you was the spin on that, right? That was the hook.
Trump is for you. Kamala Harris is for they, them. And, on its face, right, you would hope that something like that wouldn't have an effect, right? Because it is sort of wrapped up in general intolerance and this othering of specific groups of people, which I think is extraordinarily dangerous. But the problem is like human nature, right? It is actually quite effective when
it's about me.
The majority of
it's always about me. Everything's 100%. About me. Yeah.
100%. So that's where I think that's some of the messaging may have fallen flat, or there were issues. And again, we're putting it in context of a campaign on a condensed timeline. It's very difficult to again ramp up a campaign like that, let alone figure out what the right messaging is going to be on a campaign. Then also figuring out how do you respond to these issues where you don't necessarily want to be insensitive to different groups of people, but also like you do want to speak to the majority of Americans who aren't generally thinking about these social issues day to day. They're thinking about grocery prices. They're thinking about their place in society, their status in society. So those are sort of the issues. In terms of messengers, I think to some extent, yes, like the celebrity endorsements might play into it. Again, we'll have to do a really deep dive on what types of endorsements matter, which things help, which things hurt. I think it probably will be a mixed bag, right? Like some situationally specific things will absolutely help, and then some things will hurt. Other things will be just neutral, right? So I think like if you look at the celebrity endorsements and the messengers that were tapped to carry forth some of these messages by the campaign, I think
used by both sides, by the way. Celebrities were used on both sides, different kinds of celebrities, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the interesting thing about this is actually a really interesting point is beyond the messaging, but the sort of mediums that we looked at during this campaign. So on the Democratic side, you had a lot of endorsements from folks who you would consider from like legacy media, entertainment, like Taylor Swift's,
Agreed.
Beyonce, like so mega celebrities, right?
Yeah,
Huge
yeah.
reach. And I would argue too, like honestly, like a Taylor Swift or a Beyonce endorsement probably did help on the margins to some extent,
Hmm.
and didn't hurt. But the other celebrity endorsements maybe not so much. On the right side of the aisle, though, what we ended up seeing was a what we ended up seeing were they really tapped into this sort of like the world of podcasts, the world of online influencers, comedians, like these sort of culturally relevant messengers who genuinely, generally, I think, build stronger bonds with their audience. Now, again, like we can put like Taylor Swift aside or a Beyonce aside for a second because they're kind of outliers in that space. But I think if you again look at like the Joe Rogans of the world, and I'm not saying he endorsed Trump, but like Trump obviously appeared on the podcast and it wasn't I would say universally. I mean, it wasn't a great interview, but it wasn't also like he was there and it wasn't a catastrophe either. So that helps. Tony Hinchcliffe, right? The Kill Tony guy that did the joke about Puerto Rico. All of those people have built these very strong relationships with their audiences and you see them constantly, especially among young men, right? And that's where I think we saw the impact on messengers and like the mediums and where each of the parties kind of leaned into different ways of communicating with voters through third party influencers.
I love that because there's so much credit has been given to podcasts, which of course I'm all for it. I work in podcast. I love that headline. But truthfully, what you're describing there is niche media, that we've gotten to the point where you need to find powerful niche media for this size of an election and use that niche media and the hosts of those as the influencers that they are. That's exactly what you're describing here.
Oh, 100%. And I think even beyond niche media, right? Like if you think about like some of the biggest podcasts in the world, a lot of those podcasts, the reach of the actual audio episodes is huge.
Absolutely.
But the knock-on reach of those things on clips, on different things that you see on Reels or TikTok, is amplified 100 times, and it's very hard to measure truly how much reach some of these people have, and also they kind of lend themselves to these bite-sized moments where traditional celebrities, there's some of that, but it doesn't automatically translate to that sort of short form video that I think we're used to.
I love what you're describing, and you compared the Joe Rogan, Dana White, and how they've connected with their audience in a way that perhaps maybe Taylor Swift hasn't. Maybe she's wonderfully famous and obviously loved. She's as you and I speak, she's putting on a concert in Toronto, and they shut down the 401 section of the 401, which, believes me, causes chaos in the city. So I'm not saying she's not loved, but maybe there isn't this "I will do anything" for Taylor Swift feeling amongst her supporters, election-wise, as there might be for Joe Rogan's supporters. They're just different kinds of influencers.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. So, and not that Taylor Swift's fan base wouldn't do anything for Taylor Swift, or that
Agreed.
didn't have again some impact, but I think
positive,
some positive impact for the Democrats. But I think ultimately, Taylor Swift is a talented musician, and it's
but she's not one of us. She's not one of us.
Well, that's part of it, but I think the bigger issue is when you look at these influencers, particularly ones that appeal to younger men, is that they actually talk about not necessarily political issues specifically, but they talk about things that are political adjacent or politics adjacent or social adjacent, and they are constantly reminding young men about their station in the electorate, their station in life, and I think that's a huge difference where you have these guys like Joe Rogan or some of these other folks who speak to those types of issues in almost every podcast, and you don't get that at a Taylor Swift show, right? You go to a Taylor Swift show, and granted, she is a very socially conscious person
Absolutely.
and speaks out when she feels like she needs to. But you're going to a Taylor Swift concert for the performance, and it's a fantastic performance. It's a wonderful performance that obviously engages millions of people, and
Clearly.
and her fans love her, and that's great. but you're not hearing that constant drumbeat of talking about these cultural issues, these economic issues. You're not constantly being reminded of your place in the world. Whereas like on a Joe Rogan or you know, a Jordan Peterson type thing, right? And like, again, not explicitly political most of the time, but we are talking about these social issues, or like, where do young men fit into the and I use young men as an example because I think that's probably where some of this stuff was most influential. If you look at the early data, like young men swung pretty hard right relative to some of these other groups. So I think like if you look at some of those influencers, it's just the content that they are putting out. Yeah. It just sits just outside of that. Even Theo Von to some extent, right? It's like this idea of you know, free speech again has become a huge catch-all, I think, for a lot of these guys, where it's like, I can't say what I want, I'm going to get canceled. Well, obviously that's not true, right? Like they all have podcasts with massive audiences and have said some pretty edgy stuff and very much have not been canceled. They have a gigantic platform, but it's that sort of like grievance that is implied to the audience that I think makes it potent when they do become involved in the political process and they do make those endorsements. So it's definitely an interesting thing. And I don't think that there is necessarily an equivalent on the left, right? So like if you look at the Call Her Daddy podcast, right? Great podcast. Vice President Harris went on there. I thought she did a great job on that podcast. But again, it's not super political adjacent, and that's just one, right? That's just one podcast out of a sea of a bunch that where you have, you know, a lot of these guys you know, again, beating the drum on these issues. So it's kind of an interesting environment that we're living in.
I agree. I think the Dems are going to have to find the influencers who don't just perform for me, but those that I feel walk with me. What about the role of traditional media then? You're welcome to disagree with me, but I do feel the overwhelming majority of traditional media was overtly supportive of the Democratic campaign. There's always Fox News, you know, that certainly goes the other way. Was that, for the first time, it felt like that was a negative. Not only did it not help, it felt like maybe it hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was sort of a double-edged sword, right? So at times it did feel like there was a positive frame around the reporting about the Harris campaign. But I will say that in the lead up to Vice President Harris becoming the nominee, it was not a universally positive sort of environment, right? So they had created this sort of confusing narrative around politics. So I'll give you an example, personal example. So I won't name names here, but I had gotten a call from a reporter at one point before President Biden decided to not seek re-election. And the premise of this reporter's question was, there's all of this economic development activity going on in the Philadelphia region, Southeast Pennsylvania, unprecedented amount of economic development, infrastructure, manufacturing, different clean energy initiatives. And the premise of the question was, well, will President Biden get credit for it? And I thought to myself, well, that's an odd frame for it, right? Like it's as if these things fell from the sky and all of a sudden you're asking me if someone will get credit for it, rather than saying, you know, the Biden administration did X, Y, and Z, and that's why these things are happening, rather than asking, will they get credit? So I think this, the impulse of more traditional media outlets to cover things as a horse race constantly and find the conflict and everything, made it very difficult for Democrats, because it feels like a conflict when there is no conflict, right? We had a bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, pass, right? Bipartisan. So it was supported by members of both parties. It is broadly popular if you pull the provisions within that. The Inflation Reduction Act, same thing. And yet, you still have these, like, where's the conflict? Where's the fight? How can we figure out where the horse race is and frame this in a way that looks like a this versus that type situation, rather than just making a plain statement of like, here are things that happened and here's the effect of those things. It's more who's going to get credit, or who's up or who's down, or who's winning or who's losing. And that is not necessarily, in my view, the most productive way. So I think that edge of the sword definitely cut against Democrats. And then by the time Vice President Harris got into the race, yes, there was some, reporting about her the rallies and the excitement around her campaign and like all of those things. And that was fine. Like that, I think that was great, but it wasn't universal. I mean, that wore off eventually too, because there were stories about, oh, well, what does she say about her past positions on this or that? And, why isn't she doing more interviews? It's like, well, again, we're talking about running a campaign in a matter of weeks rather than, a matter of over a year. So, again, you got to have to give her grace, but she wasn't given much. So I think it did cut both ways a little bit. I mean, the other thing too to keep in mind in the United States is that we have a vast ecosystem of local news too. A lot of them are owned by a company called Sinclair, which happens to have a little bit more of a right-leaning bent. So when they report news on your local affiliate for, I don't know, one of the broadcast networks, that news is sometimes tinged a little bit with a right-leaning viewpoint.
Oh, and I wouldn't necessarily see that because that's the local news. What I'm exposed to is the national news.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, what most people outside of the United States will see are clips from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, the networks ABC, NBC, CBS, the national, to your point, national news. But the right of center or right wing media ecosystem is much more sophisticated and much more widespread than what we have on the left. Right. I mean, you cannot name an alternative to Fox. I mean, you could say, okay, like MSNBC is the answer to Fox News, but it's not. It's not the same thing. The left does not have, again, access to these local TV stations in the way that a Sinclair broadcasting would. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Is like if you drill down into, again, the media ecosystem, the Republicans have done a fairly good job of, or folks who are supportive of the Republicans have done a fairly good job of building out a media ecosystem in a way that the left does not have access to.